I'd like to agree with you, but I can't.
Yorgos Panayotides is the Contrarian.
Today I would like to talk about something that we do a lot on the show, but that we never really talk about. Reviews. And by extension, reviewers. From the conversations I've had with gamers, reviewers, designers and publishers, as well as the online discussions about this topic, it seems to me that there are certain established positions taking hold in the hobby. And I wouldn't have called this series The Contrarian if I agreed with them, so here are a collection of thoughts that I believe are not shared by the vast majority of gamers. Since our social media consultant has informed me that people of the internet have a fondness for lists, I shall now present to you my top 5 disagreements when it comes to reviewing games. Number 5. Payment. One of the most prominent stances gamers everywhere take when it comes to game reviewers is that companies shouldn't pay them. A paid review is unacceptable. It is the end of a reviewer's integrity, the abdication of responsibility towards their audience. Which of course makes sense. Since you're not paying for the review, why should a company pay a reviewer? It's not as if reviews are work or worth money. Clearly. Now, in order to explain why I do not have an issue with reviewers getting paid for the reviews, it helps to further consider what the underlying reasons are for people's reticence to companies paying reviewers, namely the conflict of interest that arises. I believe the argument is outlined as follows. A reviewer who is paid by a publisher will seek to ensure future payment by only giving good publicity, that is to say positive reviews, to games by that publisher. A bad review will sour the relationship and thus end the payment. But regardless of that, a reviewer would still need to produce a decent review. In order to sway their audience, they would still need to lay out arguments as to why a game is worth their consideration. That is far more difficult and frustrating to pull off when you have to ignore large parts of the game that simply don't work. For most people, it's hard to lie. It's even harder to lie constantly and in a way that is coherent and believable. Even if they could, it would require their audience to not figure things out. It would require them to digest their review without noting any contradictions, any logical leaps or conspicuous omissions, and continue paying attention to the reviewer. I believe this is ultimately the reason why paid reviewers and assumed conflicts of interest are such an issue for people. If we can't be sure the reviewer isn't in the pocket of a publisher, we're not sure how to read their reviews. We're not sure when to trust their argument and when to assume some ulterior motive. Trust is the natural antidote to critical thinking. We trust reviewers, so we don't have to question what they're telling us. Their getting paid means we have to deeply and critically think about what a reviewer says, why they might say it, and if their argument is sound. In short, we would have to treat the review with the same care and critical approach that we expect reviewers to have towards the game they play. And we don't want that. We're not interested in putting in work to understand where a reviewer is coming from. We want easily digestible arguments, sound bite-sized verdicts, and a clear, if possible, binary stance on whether a game is good or bad. If that sounds like a slam on people consuming reviews, it isn't. It's perfectly normal to think this way. I do it myself. It's the best way to pare down mental effort when reading, watching, or listening to reviews. We have all kinds of things on our mind at any time during the day. It's nice to slow down for a moment and just pick up a recommendation from somebody whose opinion you value, as opposed to decoding and dissecting some random internet person's argument. The issue isn't that reviewers would get paid, but whether such a reviewer still deserves our trust. And that is not the kind of question any of us wants to revisit with each and every review. But ultimately, people getting paid for work they do seems slightly more important than me not having to think too hard about what I'm consuming. Number 4. Bias. Another recurring complaint about reviewers is the accusation of bias. So-and-so is biased against any game that isn't a social deduction style yapfest. Or so-and-so doesn't play war games, so they're clearly biased against them. These statements are nonsense. Of course bias exists, and I'm sure there are reviewers out there who are in fact biased against one game or another, or a company or another. But those reviewers are generally not very good because of it. Anything that keeps you from approaching a game with an open mind will taint any attempt at saying something valuable about it. Again, the actual issue, it seems to me, is that bias is often confused with perspective, and perspective is not something to avoid, but to embrace. Any reviewer who can clearly and precisely lay out arguments for or against a game is a benefit to the hobby. A clear and tangible perspective is exactly what makes reviewers valuable. Reviewers trying to avoid this accusation of bias by relativizing their verdicts run the risk of making the reviews worthless. In a misguided attempt to be more objective in their evaluation, they turn reviews into infomercials. It is based on this weird conception of objectivity being the same as universality. And that's simply not the case. Any statement you can make about a game that is universally true is practically meaningless. To say that all games of Love Letter are played with 16 cards is universally true. But it tells you nothing about what makes the game stand out, why it took so many gaming groups by storm, and why we are now drowning in variants of it. A statement that is universally true is not objective, but irrelevant. Every review should be littered with statements that are informed by the reviewer's perspective on the game. That's what makes the review relevant. That's what makes the reviewer worth paying attention to. Number 3. Review copies. Another point of discussion that occasionally crops up when talking about reviewers are review copies, namely how to deal with them once the review has been made. And there are a lot of strongly defended and occasionally strongly worded approaches to this question. Some believe that reviewers shouldn't sell off games that they've received for free. Others believe that by fulfilling their obligation of creating a review of said game, it now belongs to them, and if they choose to sell it, then that is their decision. I firmly stand on the side that says, if you believe this is something that has an easy and clear-cut answer, you're probably deluding yourself. Neither publishers nor reviewers are some kind of monolithic block that operate under the same conditions or even with the same goals. Publishers range from one-person affairs fueled by private capital and a lot of love for the game, to mid-sized imprints that have some budget flexibility, to larger companies that could not care less what you do with that one copy of a game. On the other hand, there are reviewers out there who are scraping by, trying to keep this passion from becoming a financial albatross around their neck. There are reviewers who are financially stable enough that free review copies don't make enough of a splash to matter to the survival of their review outlet. And then there are reviewers who are drowning in free copies of games. And who is dealing with whom here makes an enormous difference. At the end of the day, selling review copies is profiting off the hard work that others have put into creating this object and justifying it by spending a fraction of that time and effort on some indirectly related work. Admittedly, this is the essence of capitalism, and credit where credit is due, people who seize this opportunity show a remarkable and strong lack of character, but that is not the point. The point is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to how to handle review copies. I think if you're a reviewer with a steady enough income stream to support your work, these kinds of perks seem tacky. But then again, what does it matter? If the publisher believes that the kind of publicity a review will generate is worth the production cost of a game, then everyone's happy. The publisher gets some publicity, the reviewer gets to create content for the channel of their choice. Whether the reviewer gets some money for selling off that reviewed game really comes down to how important money is to you. And considering the price point of your average used board game, it's not even that much money we're talking about. Number 2. Negativity. One thing I've seen repeated a few times by now is the idea that a good reviewer needs to be brutally honest and downright negative to be taken seriously. That a review channel that lavishly praises and celebrates the reviewed games loses its credibility. At first I thought that was kind of nonsensical and just fueled by the regular bitterness of the average internet rando. But over time I realized that there is a kernel of truth to the value that negative reviews bring with them. The one good thing about negative reviews is that they give you an additional piece to understand the reviewer's perspective on games, what they avoid in them, what they hope for, and even what they dislike about gaming in general. Much in the same way that you can't really get the full measure of a person if all you know about them is the things they like, a negative review gives us an insight into where the reviewer is coming from. But it has to consist of a bit more than just a prolonged joke about how much you hated the game. Out of simple respect for the designer, developer and publisher, or just to signal some basic tenet of professionalism, a negative review must be the review at the very, very top of their game. Every insight needs to be piercing, every complaint well argued, every rejection of what the game offers must be justified. This isn't about mincing words, but about using words in a way that can't be easily dismissed as sour grapes. Reviewers generally don't like to do negative reviews. There is no joy in delving into your own bad reaction to something. It's no fun to relive negative emotions again and again, and I get that. But a review shouldn't be about emotions. Yes, they should be delivered with conviction and passion, but not made that way. Because that is not a review. That is you trying to digest a bad chili. Number 1. Purpose? Purpose! Finally, what is the point of a review anyway? I've long felt very indifferent about the review part of the show. It seemed like something a podcast should do, because that is what podcasts do. But it never really struck me as particularly interesting in and of itself. I'm not entirely sure when that view changed, but it did. I have never, and still do not, consider the primary function of a review to be a buying guide for the audience. As other people have pointed out, the game itself is only one part of the experience. It is the blueprint, or the shooting script of your game night. Whether that is going to be a rousing success or a dreary slog is not entirely down to the quality of the game itself, even if it does heavily influence it. Your group matters. It's the cast of your game night. Without it, and sometimes without the right director to get the most out of them, even the best games are going to be a dicey proposition. Yes, I know, it's a terrible joke. But over time I've slowly realized that talking about games means you're also talking about gamers. And by doing so, you are vaguely, indirectly, arguing for the type of board game community you want to see. Pointing out the weaknesses of a game is also a way to talk about the things that we struggle with in our gaming life. If a game is too short, maybe it's because we expect more than just fleeting moments of distraction from games. If a game is too simple, maybe we don't see ourselves as engaging in a child's hobby when we play. If a game is too shallow, then maybe we expect something more meaningful from play than racing after some arbitrary collection of points. A review can be the springboard for such arguments. It can be a way of talking about the kind of gaming we want to be part of. Why does this game make us laugh? Why does that game make us feel different? Why does this game bore us? There are so many ways in which games can ignite human interaction between players. Why should anyone limit themselves to calling them fun or not fun? A reviewer should try to uncover and put into words the experience that a game promises and delivers, and whether that is worthwhile. Why is Pandemic so fantastic? Why is Diplomacy so awful? Why is Twilight Imperium such a joy to play? Why is Monopoly not? If such a review informs somebody else's purchasing decision, fantastic. But it is not its primary purpose. It's not the reason why I want to make reviews. I just like to talk in depth about games. I like to celebrate games that are well done, that aim to create an experience that is worth something. If I can put that experience into words and it sounds like something you want as well, then by all means buy the games I like. Whether you should or not is simply not a particularly pressing question for me when I do a review. I think that is enough contentiousness for now. Next week will be a regular episode again, and it may or may not contain a review.